It's been a while. Unfortunately, quite a few things came up in my life over the past few months, and it hasn't been the easiest few months, for any of us I imagine, but it sure feels good to be back talking about the latest happenings in this crazy open-air asylum we call our country and the wider world. And my word, a lot has happened since the last time we spoke, and I've got a lot to talk about and show you. So without any further ado, nearly 3 months of news. Where to begin? I guess we'll start with the shortages. If you live in England, you'll obviously know about the massive petrol shortages we had a few weeks ago. How could you miss it? But any overseas viewers might have missed the overnight queues, fights at pumps. One guy even pulled a knife on another motorist for jumping a queue. Then there's the food shortages. In fact, it's gotten to the point where supermarkets are deploying cardboard cutout food to conceal empty shelves. Of course, this has led to concerns around Christmas being expressed by several major food companies, including Tesco and Iceland and Nestle, and people won't be able to buy quality streets, and the children won't get any toys. Horror! Panic! The media are great at selling a panic. Just look at where we've been for the past 20 odd months. And everyone knows they only exacerbate the problem. Just take a look at who people were blaming on the BBC's own coverage of the fuel crisis.
Who's to blame in all of this? I don't know.
It's the media.
Right.
Yeah. It's the media that's done it.
Who do you blame then?
Who do I blame? I blame the media, and I'm sorry to say that, because if nobody said about this, and the lorry drivers and everything, then this panic wouldn't have started.
Of course, the media exacerbates the problem, but why are there shortages? Well, some smooth brains have been blaming Brexit, but judging by the shortages around the world, including in the EU, for example, the German car industry has been ground to a halt by the supply chain issues they're having over there, so we know that's total hogwash. Then they blamed the petrol crisis on a shortage of HGV drivers. I wonder why that could be. And then of course it was a shortage of butchers to explain the food shortages, because that's precisely why Tesco has no asparagus. Of course, the disruption caused by the Insulate Britain protesters probably had some impact, but we'll get into that a bit later. Another major factor in the petrol crisis was this government's dogmatic obsession with all the green nonsense, which nobody voted for. According to some petrol retailers, they were emptying their tanks in preparation for the switchover to E10 fuel when the media slammed them with all the scare stories that triggered all the panic buying. Curiously, the green agenda has been causing a lot of problems to ordinary people's lives, with gas prices surging to record highs, and prices due to rise further with the energy cap rising by £400 next spring, plus additional proposals for a green energy surcharge to fuel net zero. And don't even get me started on all the talk around the blackouts this winter. But that's missing the bigger issue. You see, it's not just gas that's getting more expensive, but everything. Building materials, food, oil, aluminium, which is driving up the price of used cars, and the price of petrol hit its 8-year high back in August before any of the panic buying began, though that didn't stop the Times from republishing the same figure in late September, trying to blame it on panic buying. Farmers are warning food prices will rise 10% with the Great Reset. Their words, not mine. And the Bank of England's reporting inflation could top 5% next year. Now, if food prices rise 10% and it costs you 10% more money to buy the same goods, that means when it actually comes to using your money in the real world, its value has decreased by 10%, not 5%. But we touched on how the Bank of England misrepresents inflation statistics way back in my Money Myth video last December. Something you don't see in the mainstream media is that the M1 money supply in the UK has increased by roughly 25% since the start of 2020. It's not as bad as America, where roughly 80% of all money in circulation at the moment was created within the past year, but it gives you some indication as to what could be coming over the hill. Which is precisely why the shortages are such a convenient misfortune. More people with more money in their pockets, wages are rising at the highest rate in 24 years, and the government are increasing the statutory minimum wage by 6.6%, buying more goods than the economy can sustain will inevitably lead to inflation. But if those people with more money can't buy those goods, the velocity of money is reduced and inflation is somewhat restrained. Obviously, prices are still going to rise due to scarcity, but those price rises are just due to shortages and supply chain issues, nothing to do with inflation at all. It's a perfect smokescreen, and not only that, but the fuel shortages also serve the green agenda in a mild form by driving up demand for electric cars. Plus, the soldiers brought in to deliver petrol gets the public used to seeing the army on the streets. But no matter the reason, the reality is shortages and price hikes severely impacting the poorest in our society. Which is why it was great to see Boris off on a £25,000 a week holiday in Costa del Sol a couple weeks ago. You need to remember, this is an incredibly stressful time for our politicians at the moment, and it's of the utmost importance that we look after their mental health. After all, you can judge a lot about the moral fibre of a society by how it treats the retarded. And it wasn't at all surprising to see our politicians acting like a bunch of petulant children as soon as the boss departed, with Liz Truss and Dominic Raab publicly squabbling over who gets to use Chevening House, with Boris having to step in to arrange a house share between the two ministers. Typical politicians, those little rascals. But it is funny. You do have to laugh. I mean, I wonder what's been going on in Parliament lately.
The mood of the House is not to have a vote on this.
Those rapscallions, Wait, what are they laughing at? An extension of the Coronavirus Act until March 2022? Looks like 3 weeks to save the NHS has become 2 years of emergency powers. And whilst extending the most draconian impositions on human liberty seen in the history of our nation, not only do they not give MPs a vote on it, but they laugh the whole way through. These MPs sure are respectful of the public who pay their salaries and benefits to represent them. And as they laugh away the people's rights and freedoms, Britain grows ever more authoritarian. Although the government backed down on their passport plans for England in September, Scotland has already introduced passports for nightclubs, which has been described as an unmitigated disaster by a body representing Scottish venues after footfall decreased 40% and some venues were forced to close early on the first weekend of rollout. Then Wales introduced passports for nightclubs, and then we heard the passport scheme was revived in England, 1 step forward and 3 steps back. Of course, we already introduced mandatory jabs for care home workers. In keeping with the theme, the DHSC initially allowed care home workers to declare themselves exempt, before Boris stepped in to announce there'd be no exemptions, and Javid told care workers to get the jab or get another job. Very respectful. Of course, it's led to massive care staff shortages, as 6 in 10 care homes have been forced to sack staff over it. But that hasn't stopped Javid from announcing mandatory jabs for NHS workers from April, despite fears that it would create the same staffing shortage in the NHS. So they'll be discharging doctors to keep people safe and healthy, because this is all about health, and an unvaccinated doctor is apparently worse for a patient's health than no doctor at all. And on top of that, there's been calls from the Labour Party and Patrick Vallance and the so-called NHS Confederation for the government to bring in Plan B, which would bring back mandatory masks, bans on indoor gatherings, and, you guessed it, vaccine passports. In fact, to quote the chief executive of the NHS Confederation, we should try to achieve the kind of national mobilisation that we achieved in the first and second waves, where the public went out of their way to support and help the health service. What kind of arse-backwards logic is that? The people's job to support the health service. Kind of like the whole rollout to children. And let's talk about that. Remember, we've got to follow the science and listen to the experts, right? Well, you'll remember that back in September, the JCVI refused to approve the vaccine for 12 to 15-year-olds. Here's what they had to say, taken straight from gov.uk. The available evidence indicates that the individual health benefits from COVID-19 vaccination are small in those aged 12 to 15 years who do not have underlying health conditions which put them at risk of severe COVID-19. The potential risks from vaccination are also small, with reports of post-vaccination myocarditis being very rare, but potentially serious and still in the process of being described. Given the rarity of these events and the limited follow-up time of children and young people with post-vaccination myocarditis, substantial uncertainty remains regarding the health risks associated with these adverse events. Overall, the committee is of the opinion that the benefits from vaccination are marginally greater than the potential known harms, but acknowledges that there is considerable uncertainty regarding the magnitude of the potential harms. The margin of benefit, based primarily on a health perspective, is considered too small to support advice progress on a universal programme of vaccination of otherwise healthy 12 to 15-year-old children at this time. So that's that, right? We're following the science, and the JCVI's advice has driven vaccination policy up to that point, so there's no reason to depart from them now. Well, seeing as local NHS trusts had already been scheduling jabs with schools before approval had been granted, ministers were reportedly very frustrated by the experts they'd previously deified, urging caution. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter as they pushed the rollout through regardless, and we began jabbing 12 to 15-year-olds. Not only that, but they don't need parental consent and can overrule their parents' decision to take the jab. Now, we've long established the limited risk the virus poses to children at this stage, and who is mainly affected. In fact, the ONS figures from March 2020 to June 2021 show the median age of death involving COVID-19 is 81 for males and 84 for females. For context, the average life expectancy in the UK is 79 for males and 83 for females. Of course, it's not just about death, it's about the other serious impacts it can have on your health, such as long COVID, which, unsurprisingly, the ONS found was far less common than the media was suggesting, with the majority of cases likely having no connection to COVID whatsoever. This is all according to the ONS, and UCL research has further established that long COVID in children has also been massively overstated. So that probably gives you some understanding as to why the JCVI suggested health benefits to children were minimal, particularly in context with the risks. They mentioned the risk of myocarditis, and over in the US, the FDA added a warning over the risk to both the Pfizer and Moderna jabs. It's also been linked to Bell's palsy, and of course those aren't the only potential side effects, as you can see from the MHRA's vaccine analysis print. Over 350,000 reported adverse reactions to the Pfizer jab, 576 of which were fatal. In fact, one study from the University of California, which was reported in The Telegraph, found that teenage boys were 6 times more likely to suffer vaccine-induced heart disorders than to be hospitalised with COVID. Sure, there's risks associated that children aren't told about, thus voiding their ability to give informed consent, as per Montgomery and Lanarkshire Health Board, but it's all worth it to protect the elderly, right? After all, it still prevents injectees from catching and passing on the disease, so children won't be able to pass it on to their grandparents, right?
A lot of protection against serious illness and death, but it doesn't protect you against catching the disease, and it doesn't protect you against passing it on. So now is the time to get your booster.
Right, okay, so it doesn't protect you against passing it on. In which case, why are we vaccinating children? Well, don't ask any questions. It'll be jabs for 5-year-olds next. The US has already given approval for over 5s. The BBC health correspondent explains the logic. Although most children are unlikely to get seriously ill if they catch coronavirus, they may still be infectious, even with no symptoms. The vaccine could help stop them from spreading the virus to others. So, just as it's apparently the patient's duty to look after the doctor, we now apparently jeopardise the kids to protect the elderly. Totally not backwards logic at all. But because protection from these miraculous marvels of modern medicine now apparently only lasts a few months, they've started rolling out boosters, in spite of the World Health Organization advising against the immediate rollout of boosters. Following the omniscient gods of science again, I see. But unfortunately, that means I can't express an opinion either way on the subject of boosters on YouTube, as their official policy on medical misinformation prohibits content that contradicts local health authority information or World Health Organization medical information. If I say anything against them, I'm contradicting local health authorities, but if I speak in support of them, I'm contradicting the World Health Organization. Isn't this a lovely world we live in? And don't think it'll stop with dose 3 or 4. The government's most recent order of 35 million Pfizer doses isn't due to arrive until the second half of 2022, at a cost of £1 billion to the taxpayer, may I add. Oh, and if you don't take it, the government reserves the right to take away your freedoms again. Remember when we were told there's this new virus and we just need to stay home for a few weeks to slow the spread so that the health service isn't overwhelmed and we'll all be back to normal in a month? Then it was, we need to keep restrictions until we've got a vaccine, but once the elderly and the most vulnerable are protected, we can all return to normal. That became, every adult needs to take a shot to prevent them from passing it on to their already vaccinated relatives and to protect themselves from the rampant phenomena of long COVID. And now we've arrived at long COVID is nowhere near the scale of the problem we previously thought, and the vaccine doesn't actually prevent you from catching it or passing it on, but all over 50s now need to take boosters every 6 months under penalty of losing their freedom against recommendations from the World Health Organization, and we're also vaccinating children too against the advice of the JCVI. Hashtag following the science. The reason for these policies? We're the government. We don't need to give you a reason. The water is boiling, my froggy friends. But beyond the simple authoritarianism, there's something more sinister here, a sense of betrayal that could lead a more cynical-minded person to conclude that our democracy in this country is nothing more than a total farce. You see, the people elected a Prime Minister who was presented as a libertarian conservative candidate, representing low taxation and limited public spending, and someone who went out of his way to appear as a fierce opponent to the so-called woke communist subversion. Unfortunately, it appears to have been a case of false advertising on all fronts. I mean, when even the Times is calling it red Toryism and depicting Boris next to Stalin, Lenin and Engels, you know something's wrong. In regards to economic policy, you've already seen it's been spend, 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 with public spending at its highest level since the 1970s. Very conservative. And so the government has had to follow it up with tax, tax, tax. Britons are now seeing the highest tax rate since World War II, with massive tax hikes on national insurance, including slapping national insurance bills on pensioners for the first time, plus council tax hikes. Oh, and only 10 Tory MPs voted against the tax hikes. Let's take a quick look at the Conservative Party's 2019 manifesto on which they were elected. First page, my guarantee from Boris Johnson. We will not raise the rate of income tax, VAT or national insurance. In a democracy, sticking to the manifesto promises on which you were elected isn't an option, it's compulsory. Otherwise, you live in a dictatorship, and those inhabiting the seats of power cease to be representatives, but rather traitors to the people who elected them. And looking past fiscal policy towards culture, I'm sure many of you saw Carrie Johnson's highly conservative speech at the Conservative Party conference, where she spoke of further extending gay rights, whatever that means, at a reception hosted in partnership with Stonewall, a radical far-left LGBT lobbying group with enormous influence over public bodies, including the NHS, the Scottish Government and the Civil Service, which are pressured to ban gendered words such as mother and woman, as well as the BBC and Ofcom, the latter of which was found to use its rulings to score political points with Stonewall. To quote The Spectator, it strongly suggests that Ofcom has exercised its statutory powers to regulate media output, not in accordance with the instructions it has been given by government and parliament, but to align with the agenda of an outside organisation, Stonewall. Oh, and they receive £1 million of public money each year, including £500,000 from the NHS, to lobby them. That's like paying protesters to picket outside your house and using other people's money to do so. And aside from the LGBT stuff in schools, which Stonewall encourages teaching from reception, they're also teaching racial Marxism, with one school holding a mock trial and subsequently finding guilty a Tory MP for ancestral links to slavery. I mean, if you're going to hold a mock trial for a Tory MP, there are many crimes you could stick him on, but being born wrong isn't one of them, and it's not a message to teach children. And universities aren't much better, with Edinburgh University paying students £15 an hour to decolonise the curriculum, with an interest in decolonising the curriculum and a strong commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion being essential requirements for applicants. Now, you might remember the government's commitment to protecting free speech in universities made only a few short months ago. Well, Oxford and Cambridge are exempt. Oh, and speaking of Oxford, Worcester College, Oxford recently apologised for hosting a Christian conference. Coincidentally, the head of the college was formerly chairman of Stonewall. An NHS nurse was also forced out of her job for wearing a small gold cross, which was apparently seen as a health hazard, despite her colleagues reportedly being permitted to wear jewellery, saris, turbans and hijabs. So Christianity's a no-no in the NHS, but in addition to their generous support for Stonewall, the NHS are also pushing political Black Lives Matter training courses on its staff. But it's not just the NHS. Now, this might genuinely be the most important story of the year. One of the Queen's most senior royal representatives told a Channel 4 reporter that the Queen supports the Black Lives Matter movement. Let me repeat that. The Black Lives Matter movement. Not a commitment to equality or a general opposition to racism, but publicly supporting a political movement. For those not familiar with how our constitution works, the monarch stepping into politics is an absolute no-no, if not the biggest no-no per constitutional convention. In fact, the last time a monarch's done anything even close was in 1708 when Queen Anne withheld royal assent from the Scottish Militia Bill. And she was also heard ranting about the foreign leaders who don't do enough to tackle that pesky climate change. So either the Queen doesn't care about our constitution, or her mind's beginning to slip with old age. I'd recommend putting her in a taxpayer-funded home where people wait on her hand and foot and care for her every need, but she's been living in one for the past 95 years, so it wouldn't be a change. What we really need is people to realise that those who rule over them are no more than traitors and criminals who are apparently above the law and above the peasantry. The most recent example was Tory MP Owen Paterson taking £500,000 from two companies to lobby the government on their behalf, and facing a 30-day suspension for clearly breaching lobbying rules, before his fellow Tory MPs simply voted not to suspend him and to instead overhaul the Common Standards Committee. Above the law. Another, slightly less egregious example of MPs being above the peasantry was the recent reintroduction of mandatory masks inside Parliament, but only for the commoners. MPs are exempt. They aren't dirty disease carriers like the common working folk. Though I guess one plus for parliamentary staff is that, like 5 million other public sector workers, they'll be receiving a pay rise under Rishi Sunak's new super conservative budget. We do love our public sector, the cream of our nation. For example, the DVLA, who sat around on 56,000 HGV licence applications while the petrol crisis was in full swing, threatening to strike over a single alleged COVID death of a DVLA staffer, over which the DVLA were cleared of any health and safety breaches in the midst of the most stringent restrictions, until they each received a payout of £735, courtesy of the British taxpayer. But it's not only the DVLA threatening to strike, oh no! As you're probably aware, the NHS isn't exactly the best at providing service at the moment, with GPs still failing to see patients face to face, and the problem worsening with the number of face-to-face consultations dropping by over 1 million over the month of September. And that's to say nothing of the hundreds of appointments cancelled in Scotland due to COP26 traffic. A mother died whilst waiting on the phone for a GP appointment. A 16-year-old girl died as a result of a heart attack after NHS 111 told her father not to call an ambulance. Doctors throughout England have also been told to stop all non-essential blood tests, and hospitals have been rationing chemotherapy due to staff shortages. One of the UK's leading cancer experts believes we'll see around 25,000 additional cancer deaths over the next 5 years as a result, and reports suggest the backlog could take a decade to clear. And on top of the cancer deaths, there's also the excess deaths from heart disorders going untreated. Not exactly world-beating medical care. And to give the government some credit, they've noticed the problem too. And Sajid Javid has asked GPs to step up and see more patients face to face. And their reaction only further confirmed they're a bunch of petulant children. First, the British Medical Association warned that asking doctors to see more patients could lead to an exodus of doctors leaving the profession. Javid was then condemned by former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, and then GPs began threatening industrial action, and the BMA is now balloting members on strikes. The NHS union, GMB, will also be balloting members over strike action, but they're apparently demanding a 15% pay rise, so it's a completely separate matter. One union wants doctors to stop seeing patients because they don't like being told to see patients, and the other union wants doctors to stop seeing patients because they think they should be paid more, disproportionately higher than the rest of the population, for failing to see patients. In fact, the BMA has already told GPs to stop seeing any new patients in protest of the Health Secretary's bullying. But not only do they provide poor service and throw their toys out the pram like entitled little brats, they lie too. For example, GPs have been logging phone appointments as face-to-face consultations, skewing official figures. Another lie comes from the quote-unquote hero nurse who saved Boris Johnson, saying anti-vaxxers are now begging for the COVID jab. And the Telegraph recently ran an interview with an intensive care doctor who ranted about his wards filling up with, and I quote, anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers. But let's take a look at who's actually dying with COVID from a recent report from Public Health Scotland, which breaks down COVID deaths by vaccination status. As you can see, out of 500 patients who died with COVID, 393 of them were double jabbed. That's nearly 80%, compared with only 89 unvaccinated. That's less than 18%. Of course, that's to say nothing of the recent Telegraph investigation that found that over a quarter of what's presented as COVID hospital admissions are not primarily COVID. But it's not just doctors lying. Police lie too, systematically, according to police whistleblower Tom Coling, who alleges he was ordered to tamper with evidence at the crime scene of a dead baby and to arrest 2 innocent men for serious child abuse accusations for which there was no evidence, and on another to report a dog to the RSPCA despite no concerns about its well-being or behaviour, and that he was subject to disciplinary proceedings for refusing to obey unlawful orders. We also recently heard about yet another Westminster paedophile investigation being covered up, with police being found to have failed to properly investigate Labour MP Lord Janner. But let's get into the police a bit later. I've talked about the UK for quite a while now, so let's move on to some international news. Over in the US, Joe Biden ordered big businesses to impose vaccine mandates on their employees, with some airlines firing staff for not taking the jab, and he's also introduced mandates for federal workers too. I just find it ironic in the context of the recent Texas abortion bill restricting the deliberate killing of human beings. Of course, this was a terrible attack on women's rights, according to a state judge who blocked the enforcement of the ban, and Texas abortions resumed. But the Biden administration has also filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Texas over the bill's alleged incompatibility with the Constitution, and he's requested the Supreme Court to block the bill. So, depriving women of the ability to kill their offspring is a dreadful and unconstitutional imposition on freedom and bodily autonomy, but federally mandating that workers have to take something into their body or else they won't be able to feed their families, that's not unconstitutional or an infringement on bodily autonomy in the slightest. I guess my body, my choice only covers one's choice to murder. But it's not just the federal government that's been steamrolling people's rights, with many blue state governors giving Joe a run for his money. California, for instance, has mandated vaccines for all students from kindergarten through to 12th grade, in both public and private schools. In New York, city employees who don't take the jab are not only losing their jobs, but their eligibility for unemployment benefits is also dependent on vaccination status, forcing unvaccinated New Yorkers to flee. In fact, BLM in New York have threatened a national uprising over vaccine mandates, which includes bans on anyone unvaccinated over the age of 12 from eating in a restaurant. But to give the Democrats some credit, they've managed to unify BLM and the police, with many officers quitting the force in response to vaccine mandates, resulting in shortages in some blue cities, such as Chicago, and in Seattle, police have been flying "Don't Tread on Me" flags from their cars. And Ice Cube, who famously penned "Fuck the Police," walked away from a $9 million movie deal after refusing to take the jab. But the new song seems to be "Let's Go Brandon," originating from an NBC reporter hearing chants of "Fuck Joe Biden" at a NASCAR race and inaccurately reporting on it as "Let's Go Brandon," the winner of the race.
As you can hear the chants from the crowd. Let's go, Brandon!
Let's Go Brandon has thus become a more family-friendly way of expressing one's feelings about the president. But as a reflection of the popularity of the phrase, several rappers made songs out of it, and one topped the iTunes hip-hop charts. Although an even better reflection might be the polls indicating Biden's popularity has dropped faster than any other president since the Second World War, or perhaps the many protests sweeping the nation. In New York, tens of thousands of people marched against mandates, including outside the New York Times headquarters, and firefighters organised a mass protest outside Mayor Bill de Blasio's house, where angry protesters trashed his lawn. In California, there's been huge protests against the governor's mandates for schools. And employees of many of the big businesses implementing mandates have also staged walkouts or protests, such as Southwest Airlines, American Airlines, Boeing, and General Electric. Similarly, in Canada, Trudeau's government has introduced mandates for all over 12s in order to access public transport, and similarly, they've seen very, very big protests. In New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern's gone further than just issuing mandates, saying she wants to create 2 distinct classes for the vaccinated and unvaccinated.
Well, it's almost like you probably don't see it like this. There's 2 different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights If you are vaccinated,
That is what it is. So, yep.
And although they've been pretty heavy-handed, there's still been protests over there. Italy's seen the same thing with their Green Pass and stricter mandates than most other countries, and the Italian people have responded with massive protests throughout the country, most notably a dock workers' strike in Trieste from workers who otherwise wouldn't have been able to work anyway due to the mandates, and non-stop protests for the past several weeks have effectively blocked the port of Trieste. Of course, as with anywhere else, the police have used violent methods in an attempt to disperse the protesters, but they go on. In Germany, there have also been huge protests, and there the police response actually drew the attention of a UN Special Rapporteur on torture after a video emerged of a cop shoving an elderly woman to the ground. In Switzerland, they've had huge protests with traditional cowbells. And of course, the traditional clashes with police. In the Netherlands, there have been huge protests against mandates. In France, protests against mandates. Greece, protests. Austria, protests. Huge protests against the health pass in Slovenia. Bulgaria's seen protests. Meanwhile, here's a protest in Luxembourg. Here's a massive rally against mandates in Latvia. And here's Estonia. But perhaps most interesting and frightening of all is what's going on in Australia, which had the world's strictest lockdown restrictions and now has arguably the world's strictest vaccine mandate on the cards, in addition to perhaps the world's most violent and despotic response to the anti-authoritarian protesters. I had a conversation with a good friend down under, Krishul the Esoteric Noetic, a couple weeks ago, and you can find the full conversation on his channel. I'll leave a link in the description below to both his Odyssey and YouTube channels, as he got a strike on YouTube recently. So go show him some love. But here's a short excerpt on what it's like in Australia now.
Australia it really feels like a prison, man. I mean, when you realize that, I mean, granted, it's not like in your face, like yet the police are not at at least they're not on my doorstep, you know, touch wood, but they actually have been.
Doorsteps.
That's true. Exactly. But the thing is, it's weird because officially we're still saying Scott Morrison is still going out saying that, you know, you have a choice. We in Australia, we're free. We believe in a fair go. But on the flip side, we're essentially being coerced to get this thing, the point where you can't work, you won't be allowed access into the convenience stores, you won't be allowed to do anything unless, of course, you get the jab. And of course, this is all unlawful. They're playing this sleight of hand where they're trying to get past the Constitution, get past all of the legality, and try to coerce employers to force people to get the jab. And I've been witnessing firsthand my friends, my family get the jab. It is a nightmare, man. I've actually witnessed firsthand people that have not only suffered emotionally because of this, but have actually suffered the physical effects. Like there are people that are close to me that have had adverse reactions, and I'm trying to help them out with this stuff because a lot of people just don't know that they have a choice, you know. But that's Australia, bro, and that's not even a fraction of the shit that's going on. There are protests, the construction workers, everyone is getting involved in this thing, man, and it is on everyone's mind. You can't get away from this. People are angry, they're fired up, and it's on both sides of the coin. I mean, there's some people that are like, oh, shame on you lockdown protesters. You're the reason why we're still in these lockdowns, right?
These far-right figures have been mobilising all across the country, peddling conspiracy theories and lies that the vaccine is unsafe and that lockdowns are a communist plot to destroy freedom.
The problem I think we're having here in Australia is that whereas we don't have the same numbers as you guys do in the UK, we have such a difficult, I say we, of course, I would never go to a protest. I'm just covering this stuff. I'm an independent journalist. But these protests can't even take place because the police essentially are just pulling this OG move. I mean, they shut off all of the transport for one of the protests, like a few weeks back. I think it was about maybe a month back, where they shut down public transport for a whole day, for half of the day. Like, that's a huge deal. So all the people that wanted to go to work had to make other arrangements. That would have lost a lot of revenue. You know, I mean, we're losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single week at the moment. You know, we've been in these lockdowns for. But the point I'm trying to make is that the media, the police force, they will do everything in their power to, they'll come to your doorstep. If you post this stuff on Facebook, that you're going to one of these protests, they'll try to scare you, come to your household. And I just feel like maybe the New World Order agenda is maybe more in full swing here in Australia, because we got helicopters flying around these protest sites, man. The news reporters weren't even able to cover this shit because they don't want the idea getting out internationally that these protesters are as big in number as they actually are. So is that same kind of stuff happening with the protests that you guys have?
Definitely not to the same extent. I mean, I'm thinking of one clip in particular from I think it was from Melbourne a few weeks ago, that went fairly viral. I'm not sure if you saw it, of a guy who was sort of staying put while the police were moving in with guns, dispersing the crowd, and they sort of walked right up to this guy, pointing in his face. They moved back, and he's like, "No," and then they just stepped back.
That
so
makes
what,
me
what,
proud.
What do you do here?
That's the Aussie spirit that we're known for.
One piece of, quite frankly, terrifying legislation currently making its way through the Australian Parliament is the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment, granting the Premier the ability to indefinitely extend a pandemic declaration, and the Premier makes the decision every 3 months as to whether to extend the declaration. They have to consult with the Minister for Health, but there doesn't need to be any kind of parliamentary vote. Permanent emergency powers in the hands of one man. That's never gone wrong any time before in history. Also, Section 165BO of the amendment introduces the new aggravated offence of failure to comply with pandemic order, direction, or other requirement. A person commits an offence if the person fails to comply with a pandemic order or with a direction given to the person or a requirement made of the person in the exercise of a pandemic management power, and B, the person knows or ought to know that the failure to comply is likely to cause a serious risk to the health of another individual. Ought to know. By whose standard? This is terrifying wording, as it suggests no mens rea is needed for the offence. The person doesn't require any knowledge or intention to break the law. So long as they ought to have known that their conduct had been arbitrarily deemed too dangerous by the government, that's all the intention needed. And also note the vague wording of failure to comply with a requirement made of the person in the exercise of a pandemic management power. No specification as to the nature of that requirement. A public official could require a member of the public to do anything, and refusal to comply could be an offence. And what's the penalty for this offence? In the case of a natural person, 500 penalty units, that's just over 90,000 Australian dollars, or imprisonment for 2 years. But notice there's been very little attention paid to Australia by the mainstream press over here. That's not important, but what is important is what's been happening in Afghanistan. When US troops withdrew from Afghanistan, as they inevitably would have to at some point, after 20 years of 21st century opium wars, and the Taliban immediately regained control, both over the country and billions of dollars in weapons left behind by the US, Joe Biden immediately drew heated condemnation from Western press and the political elite. Funny how Biden draws criticism for not colonising foreign nations, but not for sniffing and fondling preschoolers. But of course, the US couldn't go out without a bang, so in one last heroic deed, they carried out a drone strike against a group of ISIS suicide bombers en route to Kabul airport. Except they weren't ISIS suicide bombers at all, but rather an aid worker and 7 children. But don't forget, the Taliban are a bad lot. They break up protests for human rights, and there was a lot of concern that they might reintroduce mandatory burqas for women, but thankfully they haven't gone quite so far as forcing people to cover their faces. After all, mandatory face coverings are deeply oppressive. Boris Johnson himself said so. While we're on the topic of international news, another story that came to my attention was, in China, they've banned effeminate men from appearing on television. They want to reinforce the conventions of gender for the sake of national strength and stability, social cohesion, and presumably people's physical and mental health. I'm definitely not saying I agree with this policy, it's incredibly oppressive and authoritarian, but it makes an interesting contrast when you look at what's going on here in the West. You probably saw John Lewis's recent insurance advert, featuring a young boy prancing around in makeup and a dress. Precisely what the majority of parents in this country want their children seeing on television. Remember, the concept of gender is bigotry and needs to be destroyed, and is there any better way of affecting societal change than getting to the children while they're too young to question? The advert in question was actually pulled for being misleading, as it implies that the insurance covers intentional damage by a child, which it does not. But obviously that was the only only thing wrong with it. I'm sure the average salt-of-the-earth Brit wants to watch a young boy dancing sexually in women's clothing. In fact, this was actually a very popular practice in Afghanistan among homosexual paedophile warlords until the Taliban cracked down on it. So I guess that's another reason to hate the Taliban. They're the enemies of diversity and inclusion. Then again, I'm not sure if homosexual paedophile warlord is a particularly large demographic in the UK, but I guess I'll have to take their word for it. But on a more serious note, I do need to talk about a pretty major news story from a couple of weeks ago, and that's the murder of MP David Amess. We now know the killer was an extremist Islamist who was radicalised by Anjem Choudhury and was known to counter-extremism officials, and that he had plotted to kill an MP for 2 years. But that didn't stop the sanctimonious press from jumping the gun before any of these details were known, assuming it was somehow related to online misinformation and anti-politician sentiment, and attempting to score political points before the body was even cold. Here's the BBC homepage shortly after the murder, and right below the picture of the man who was stabbed to death is a picture of everyone's favourite disinformation reporter, Miss Mariana Spring, with the headline, "I get abuse and threats online, why can't it be stopped?" I'm sorry, but using a man's death to narcissistically promote episode 112 of the Mariana publicly signals her own victimhood saga has to be one of the most crass and distasteful attempts to capitalise on a public figure's death since Sky One's Michael Jackson The Live Seance.
Will someone say hello to Quincy Jones for me? Please? You see Quincy. You say hello. Please?
Hello, Quincy.
She certainly made a lucrative career out of receiving online abuse. She had 3 publishers bidding for her yet unwritten book, Among the Trolls, all about reading mean things on Twitter, landing her a lucrative deal with Atlantic. She wound up on Forbes 30 Under 30. She's met with the UN Head of Global Communications to discuss online abuse of female journalists, and most recently she's spoken in Parliament about receiving online abuse, and about her recent documentary for Panorama. To summarise, it's 30 minutes of Mariana talking about online abuse, crying about online abuse, making shocked and disgusted facial expressions at online abuse, and interviewing other women on the topic of misogynist online abuse, including Ruth Davidson, a former Australian Prime Minister, 2 Love Island contestants for some reason, and notorious NHS doctor Rachel Clark. One of the most telling findings was that both Mariana and Rachel reported that the majority of the abuse that they flagged to Twitter wasn't removed and no action was taken against the account sending this quote-unquote abuse. And it was the same with the police, who took no action on either of their complaints and no arrests were made. So it must be some real nasty abuse, and definitely not just comments the recipient dislikes or disagrees with, I'm sure. But most telling of all was when a UN researcher analysed the abuse Mariana was receiving.
This is a word cloud that represents the abuse that you have experienced. The bigger the word, the more times it's been directed against you. And you can see that this is full of expletives, full of demeaning comments, full of misogynistic comments, full of sexually explicit comments.
I don't think the editor was supposed to leave in that shot of the word map, as she's saying it's full of sexualised and misogynistic abuse, but looking at the words on the screen, and several are blurred so I can't comment on those, but out of the visible words, most are either insulting her intelligence or accusing her of lying. Of the remaining words, the vast majority are gender neutral or not even abuse, such as bloody or damn. Only 6 of the visible words could be considered misogynist abuse, and that includes the words ugly and your arse, which obviously are often aimed at men too. Not to mention all of those words, as well as the blurred words, were very small on the word map, meaning they're far less common than the larger words, the largest of which was liar, which they actually acknowledge in the documentary, but move swiftly on without addressing, lest the audiences start to question her narrative about being targeted solely because she's a woman.
But the biggest word that we see is the word liar.
1 in 5 of the women who responded to the UN survey.
But even more amusing was her latest podcast on climate change, in which she literally peddles conspiracy theories, such as that those who oppose proposed green agenda taxes and regulations are somehow all stooges in the pocket of the big oil and gas companies.
He's also spent many years observing the methods of those opposed to climate action. Fossil fuel interests, the oil, gas and coal companies and their allies.
She never attempts to substantiate this claim at any point in her podcast. No investigation exposing evidence linking big oil to people who disagree with Greta Thunberg. In fact, no other mention of big oil companies at all. But she does feature someone arguing that any person expressing disagreement with the green agenda on social media is part of some orchestrated plot by the Russians who secretly want global warming because they think Russia's too cold. No, that's not a joke.
They think that somehow they might even benefit in a warmer planet. And so that has led, for example, Russia as a state actor to engage in efforts to prevent other countries from moving on. And they've used social media in particular to try to, advance that agenda.
These are literally conspiracy theories, and you'd expect someone whose secondary job to complaining about abuse is complaining about conspiracy theories not to use national radio to propagate unsubstantiated theories about conspiracies. I mean, how does someone with these standards of journalism rise to such a prominent position in the media? I mean, it's not like she's related to a baron or part of some aristocratic family or something. She's a very ordinary person of very ordinary background. She went to an ordinary school with fees your ordinary family could afford, meeting with the Queen in 2010 at age 14, just like any other ordinary child, and being selected through some young journalist scheme to win a place at Oxford, where she studied French and Russian before immediately landing a job at the BBC upon graduation. All very ordinary and no reason to think anything more. That is, until you come across the Spring family, a family of landowners and cloth merchants who, by the 16th century, had established themselves as one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in England, which was awarded the baronetcy of Pakenham in 1641 by Charles I, when Sir William Spring pledged his support to the crown, before immediately switching sides and becoming a recruiter for the parliamentarians, a truly honourable family. The second Baron Spring was then a strong supporter of excluding King James from inheriting the throne on the grounds of being Catholic, so a tolerance to other people's beliefs and a sense of honesty both certainly run through this family. Now, the title fell dormant upon the death of the 6th Baron in 1769, but the family's still in politics, with Conservative MP Richard Spring being made Lord Risby in 2010. And aside from the obvious familial likeness between the two, if you compare their faces, remember when I said Mariana has a degree in French and Russian? Well, I'm sure it's just a coincidence that Lord Risby happens to be the government's trade envoy to Algeria and Lebanon, and speaks fluent French. As well as also coincidentally being chairman of the British Ukrainian Society and, you knew it was coming, co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Ukraine. And anyone care to guess what his most recent question in the House of Lords was about? If you guessed online misinformation about the jab, you're absolutely right. The name, the likeness, the ungodly amounts of money, the French and Russian connections, and all the ideological similarities do appear to indicate that Mariana is part of the aristocratic Spring family, and thus related to a baron. But for that reason, I urge you to be more considerate. It's natural for someone to get upset or angry when another person spreads inflammatory lies about a movement they support, and even more so when that person is profiteering from their lies. But put yourself in her shoes for a minute. The best education, the best connections, being seemingly fast-tracked in every stage of your career and constantly being told by everyone around you how exceptional you are, and you're never actually questioned or scrutinised. And then, at the age of 24, you're suddenly thrust into the spotlight, with the responsibility of putting down people who hold the wrong opinions according to the establishment. You're not going to think twice about the economic hardship or political repression of those rabble-rousing serfs. What's economic hardship? How could anyone possibly distrust the establishment when it served me so well? Those people are just wrong, and we're right, so there's nothing morally contentious whatsoever about patronisingly speaking down to them and telling them they're wrong. Then, when people start talking back to you and giving you criticism, possibly for the first time in your life, of course you're, 1, not going to know how to handle it, and 2, you're going to double down, because those people were totally alien to you to begin with, and their refusal to accept whatever you say only drives them further from you. Mariana isn't intentionally ignorant, and knowing her background, I now kind of feel bad for her. Although some of her reactions in the panorama thing were obviously exaggerated, I still get the impression that she's deeply unhappy. No one who's content in their life spends as much of their energy focusing on negativity and internet trolls as she does. It's sad, and I guess it supports that old adage that money can't buy happiness. But getting back to the broader issue of the media's response to the murder of David Ames, even after the identity of the suspect was known, the media doubled down, portraying this event as somehow caused by social media, and so the cries echoed from the press, urging more social media regulations to prevent people from saying mean things about politicians. And if you followed my channel for a while, you'll know all about the online safety bill they've been pushing for months, using any event as a justification for getting it off the ground, such as the perceived racism after the Euro final, and now some have even tried rebranding the bill as David's Law. To quote Mariana Spring, they turn their energy to whatever they think's relevant, no matter how disrespectful. Then the Speaker of the House of Commons came out against hate towards MPs, truly the most oppressed minority, and Keir Starmer called on the government to clean out the cesspit of harmful online content. And of course, the same cries were heard from government, with Priti Patel using David's death to warn about a deadly wave of terror attacks plotted by bedroom radicals, who were radicalised by online extremists on social media while stuck at home during lockdown. As I mentioned, the suspect had plotted to kill an MP for 2 years, which, believe it or not, was actually before the first lockdown. And he was radicalised by Anjem Chowdhury, whose content is already banned by social media. He actually tried to set up a Twitter account back in July, and it was deleted in under a week. So no matter what further restrictions were put in place, it wouldn't have made a difference, as the materials that radicalised this killer were already banned. But they were gunning for online privacy already, with Cressida Dick calling on the government to ban online encryption as it makes it impossible to fight terrorists, just a month before a terrorist incident being linked in the public's imagination by the press to social media companies. So, of course, Priti Patel renewed calls to ban posting online anonymously, which had been pushed pretty heavily after the penalties at the Euro final. With the online racism stuff, I can at least understand how in theory you could link that back to internet anonymity, but with David Ames, I have no idea. But as with anything else involving government, don't ask questions, we've got to steamroll ahead. The Culture Secretary is now committed to online safety reforms, and Boris has promised a debate on the online safety bill in December, with criminal sanctions and tough sentences for those who post foul material online, whatever that means. To me, it all sounds extremely Orwellian, especially now with the massive overreaction to anyone saying anything mean online to an MP, and the police resources being focused on online abuse of MPs, with a string of arrests in the aftermath of the David Ames stabbing. First, a 76-year-old was arrested for allegedly sending a death threat to Labour MP Chris Bryant. Then another man was arrested for allegedly sending threats to Angela Rayner, and then a woman was arrested for sending threats to yet another Labour MP. But it's not just Labour. Tory MP Richard Graham accused one of his constituents of sending him an implied threat for saying we are not in the mood to comply and our numbers are growing. Apparently it was incredibly inappropriate after a completely unrelated incident had taken place, and the constituent needed to treat their MP with more respect. It's good to see the press have focused on language policing those who dare speak out of turn to politicians, while absolutely no one in the mainstream press covered the recent article in the BMJ about a Pfizer research director blowing the whistle on the company having reportedly falsified data and blinded patients, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, and was slow to follow up on adverse events reported in Pfizer's pivotal phase 3 trial. No mention of that, but you've got to let the peasantry know they need to treat their superiors with respect. And if anyone's wondering where we're heading, in a recent story from China, a man was detained for 9 days for insulting the image of police for posting a meme of a dog in a police hat and expressing criticism of lockdown restrictions. This is the path our politicians are leading us down. Non-compliance is a threat, and those who insult our public servants should be thrown in jail. And speaking of the police, what a bunch of partisan cowards they've proven themselves to be. I briefly mentioned Insulate Britain earlier. For any overseas viewers who aren't familiar, they're a group of eco-nuts who spent the past couple months sitting in the middle of motorways and in some instances gluing their face to the road to demand the government pay to insulate every house in Britain to combat the so-called climate crisis. Aside from the untold economic cost on the thousands of people they've delayed in getting to work, among their other achievements, they've caused a crash that required a woman to be airlifted to hospital. They caused another woman to suffer permanent paralysis after her son was delayed by 6 hours while rushing her to hospital. And they've blocked people from accessing cancer treatment and even blocked ambulances, forcing paramedics to drag them out of the road alongside other motorists. And notice it's usually other motorists dragging protesters out of the street and not the police. In fact, not only have the police been extremely gentle with these insulated imbeciles, they've been seen actively assisting them, clearing roads for them and allowing them to take their places on several major roads.
When you do it, or whatever you're going to do, just be careful, because some members of the public obviously will get quite aggressive with you.
Yes.
And if we're at the back or we can't get through, then we can't get there to help you.
Just for context, here was their response to a recent anti-lockdown protest. In fact, when one frustrated motorist expressed his frustration by loudly playing bagpipes at the protesters, the cops dragged him away for harassment to claps from the orange-vested loons. And at Blackwall Tunnel, when police arrived, they stood around refusing to move the criminals, claiming they weren't allowed and that if any of the motorists touched them, they'd be done for assault.
Why not? The law's not wrong, by the way. Are we allowed to vote? No, what's everyone moves by the way.
Saying nothing of the police's refusal to move the patsies, it's obvious how the police are treating them, judging by the fact that their 161 members have racked up 770 arrests and not one of them has been charged. But that point about the other motorists not being allowed to touch them is legally complete nonsense if you read Section 3 of the Criminal Law Act 1967. A person may use such force as is reasonable in the circumstances in the prevention of crime or in effecting or assisting the lawful arrest of offenders or suspected offenders or of persons unlawfully at large. These protesters were committing an offence under Section 137 of the Highways Act 1980 by willfully obstructing the free passage along a highway, which thus enables any member of the public to use reasonable force in the prevention of the crime, i.e. clearing the obstruction. Now, how can I say that when I support pro-freedom protests which march in the road? Well, it's generally believed that to constitute an obstruction of the highway, you have to be stationary. While the freedom protesters are pretty much constantly moving along the highway, delaying traffic by a limited period of the few minutes it takes to pass down the street, the Insulate Britain activists sit stationary for an indefinite period until they're forcibly removed. They're not there to send a message and move on, but specifically to create a nuisance. And if we look at the House of Lords case of DPP and Jones, 1999, the public highway is a public place which the public may enjoy for any reasonable purpose, provided the activity in question does not amount to a public or private nuisance and does not obstruct the highway by unreasonably impeding the primary right of the public to pass and repass. Within these qualifications, there is a public right of peaceful assembly on the highway. So an assembly on the highway is totally lawful, so long as it doesn't unreasonably impede the primary right of the public to pass and repass, or amount to a nuisance. So marching down the street is perfectly lawful. Sitting in the road and refusing to move is not. But of course, the other differences between the freedom protesters and these eco-cultists is the fact that one group are calling for personal liberty, while the others calling for more big state impositions, spending and taxation. One group of protesters tends to target parliament and government buildings, whilst the other only targets ordinary working people. And of course, one group is acting against national and global political agendas, while the other is emphatically in support of them. So it's not really much of a surprise that the police facilitate and protect one group of protesters while brutalising the other. And speaking of the freedom protesters, I ought to talk about what's been happening since the last protest I made a video about. Now, for the same reasons I haven't been able to post anything online, I haven't been able to make it to any of the protests since the Trafalgar Square one in July, but I have seen a number of videos and live streams, and a lot has happened, from the police kettling protesters in a tube station, to protesters storming ITN television studios, to the media's outrage over veterans daring to have the wrong ideology, and the even greater outrage over Eric Clapton donating to Jam for Freedom. One event that's probably worth mentioning is when Michael Gove just so happened to be walking nonchalantly down the same street the protesters were on, totally unaccompanied, and seemingly without hearing or noticing the enormous chanting crowd marching towards him, with the police in the right place to swoop in at exactly the right time. And bear in mind, this was immediately after his colleague was stabbed to death, and whilst they were heavily pushing censorship of dissident online communication. And of course, the Prime Minister immediately made a statement condemning the protesters, and once again, the mainstream media was morally outraged, including all the mainstream hacks that people seem to think are genuinely part of this movement. Here's Julia Hartley-Brewer condemning this harassment as not acceptable. And I know I'll get some backlash for this, but I really don't care who I offend anymore. I won't let the prospect of losing a few subscribers get in the way of me giving my honest opinion, and I don't trust these mainstream media figureheads who are all beholden to and given the green light by Ofcom. In fact, while I'm on the topic, I've got to mention Mike Graham's unforgettable conversation he had with an Insulate Britain activist. Now, if you were going to interview one of these protesters, what approach would you take? Would you perhaps try to understand what motivates these people and how they've been made to believe such radical views? Or perhaps you might ask them why they target ordinary working people instead of the government? Or why they blocked a lorry carrying insulation materials? You know, actually get them on something. Well, Mike Graham had a slightly different strategy. Take a look at this.
What do you do for a living, Cameron?
I'm a carpenter.
A carpenter, right. So how safe is that for the climate?
Well, I work with timber, which is a much more sustainable material rather than concrete. I also
But you work with trees that have been cut down then, don't you?
It's a sustainable building practice.
How is it sustainable if you're killing trees?
Because it's regenerative, you can grow trees.
Right. Well, you can grow all sorts of things, can't you?
Well, you can't grow concrete.
You can. See you, Cameron. Cheerio. That was Cameron. He grows trees and then cuts them down and then makes things from them. Brilliant. Marvellous.
What do you do for a living? I'm a carpenter. That means you work with dead trees. You can grow trees. Yeah, well, you can grow all sorts of things. You can't grow concrete. Yeah, you can. Bye. This guy, he grows trees and he cuts them down and he makes things from them. Brilliant. Marvellous. I mean, with all due respect, it takes a special breed of moron to make the people who glue their faces to highways look smart. And then there's Anna Brees selling against vaccine passport face masks for $10.99. But it might be more than just the media personalities to be wary of. Now, there are a number of people pointing at literally everything and yelling, controlled opposition, this is staged, etc., without any meaningful evidence whatsoever. And a great many of these people are either 77th Brigade psychological warfare agents or completely brain dead. But Tyrant Finder, who is a very reputable content creator, made a series of videos following September's monthly protest, asking some reasonable questions about the organisation of Save Our Rights. At that particular protest, they'd led protesters on the same old route, ending in Hyde Park where a lorry with a speaker system was waiting for them, blasting electro dance music and encouraging protesters to have a dance in the middle of Hyde Park, achieving absolutely nothing, after a day of walking around London, achieving very little at best. And then, when the protesters were there and the cameras were rolling, the police threatened to move in, and the organisers insist they were given assurances by the council, and this whole pantomime ensues, with protesters eventually going home. Tyrant Finder rightfully asked, what's going on? What's the point? What do they think they're achieving? And where is this heading? Because to me, at this stage, it doesn't seem like they have any real goal of affecting meaningful political change. He also uncovered alleged links between certain individuals associated with Save Our Rights and the white supremacist group Patriotic Alternative. And he also found that Save Our Rights UK Limited is a registered company. Now, why would a group of protest coordinators need to form a limited company? Might be something to do with using Save Our Rights to promote a paid social media platform, Autarky, which company director of Save Our Rights, Phil Graham, happens to own. Join our online revolution with a 7-day free trial. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with making money or earning a living from activism, so long as you're actually providing something, whether that's carrying out a service, journalism, art, poetry, or organisation that affects meaningful change. But In what way is this movement now being advanced by staging the same old walkabout through London, following police, whilst numbers gradually decrease with people getting fed up with the futility of doing the same thing again and again with no impact? In fact, at the latest protest, Tyrant Finder actually called out Louise and Phil for following the police and lying to people.
Why are we following the police again?
We're not! They're following us! This way! Guys! Guys, trust us this way! It is this way!
No, we're not. Get off my camera, Phil.
Do not listen to the vision! We're going
You're lying, Phil. You're lying. Get off my camera, Phil.
False accusations.
Step back, Phil.
If anyone was wondering what incriminating body language looks like, you've just seen perhaps the clearest example. Compare Phil's reaction of obscuring the camera and absconding with great haste and a look on his face like a toddler caught with his hand in the cookie jar, to Resistance GB's reaction when, whilst live streaming, he was confronted by a guy who'd watched one too many John Overkill videos and was accusing him of staging his own arrest in cahoots with the police because if you slow down the video, the punches don't look hard enough or something.
Can I ask what you sort of arguing for?
Do you work with the old bill?
No.
Are you sure about that? Oh, you had a little cut of marks. I'll see what happened to you.
What are we here for? Are you showing
I'll see what happened to you on that
So
Monday.
you're here black and white and you're
I'll see
not?
what happened to you on that
Free
Monday.
speech.
Yeah, that was all set up. That was all set up, and you know it was. I'll see what happened to you on the 19th, mate. I see you what happened.
Judge me by my work.
I see what happened.
Okay, judge me by my work.
Now, say what you like about Resistance GB, but this provides a visible contrast, standing and engaging with the accuser publicly and in front of his audience, as opposed to trying to cover the camera and fleeing. And of course, there was nothing different about the last protest, aside from people throwing syringes at Parliament instead of tennis balls, albeit at much smaller numbers than back in June. I mean, encouraging people to bring syringes to a protest when the police are looking for anything they can label as an offensive weapon has to be one of the stupidest and most irresponsible actions a protest organiser could possibly take, especially right after Priti Patel extended stop and search powers for protesters in response to the Insulate Britain mob. Problem, reaction, solution. Interestingly, police took no action when Louise threw her syringes and encouraged others to do so, but swooped in as soon as an actual protester stepped forward and did exactly what Louise and Save Our Rights had told him. Now, am I saying don't go to any protests? Of course not. There are other groups organising large-scale protests, probably most notable of which now is Official Voice, so follow them on Telegram to keep up to date with alternative and generally spicier protests. As for the Save Our Rights protests, if you can make it and you have nothing better to do that day, go ahead and add to the numbers. It's always great seeing so many people taking a stand against tyranny, but numbers are declining at those rallies, despite local groups like A Stand in the Park thriving and public dissatisfaction with government increasing significantly. We've had the same peaceful marches through London time and time again, with hundreds of thousands and quite possibly millions of people showing up, and either getting lied about or totally ignored by the media, and nothing changing. And doing the same thing again and again in spite of consistent failure, that's insanity. After all, you can't change the system if you can't change your own strategy. Effecting change starts from within. And if you do attend any Save Our Rights protests going forward, I support that 100%, but just be careful, and if you're told to do anything that feels odd, use your own judgment. The next protest, as of recording this, will be the Official Voice 5th of November protest outside Parliament, but judging by the length of this video, by the time I've got it edited and up, it'll probably already be over. So if you went to that protest and you made it this far in the video, let me know in the comment section below how it went. I think that's all I have to say, aside from, once again, it's great to be back. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you all soon on the next video. God bless you.